The red paint didn't look like art. It looked like a wound, a jagged, violent slash across the centerpiece canvas that had taken Sloane 6 months to perfect. The oil dripped with a sickening viscosity, pooling on the floor. The smell hit me first. Acrid, cheap solvent clashing with the expensive champagne and designer perfume in the room. The silence was worse than the gasps. It was the sound of a reputation bleeding out. I didn't look at the crowd. I looked at Sloane, standing frozen in her silk gown. Then the flashbulb started, aggressive and blinding. I moved instantly, stepping directly between the lens and her face. Not tonight. The gallery floor, usually a sanctuary of hushed appreciation and checkbooks, had turned into a shark tank. The murmurs started low, a collective vibration of shock that quickly curdled into gossip. I could feel the energy shift in the room, the hungry curiosity of the collectors who love a disaster almost as much as a masterpiece. The air was thick, suffocatingly hot, carrying the scent of heavy perfume and the distinct metallic tang of the vandalism. I saw the critics typing on their phones, broadcasting the failure before the paint had even dried. Sloane stood inches behind me. I could feel the heat radiating from her back, a frantic, trembling energy. This was a woman who welded steel and painted with fire, an artist I had courted for 2 years because of her unshakable, ferocious vision. Now, she looked small. Her hands, usually so steady when holding a brush, were clenched at her sides, knuckles white against the dark fabric of her dress. She wasn't just embarrassed, she was in shock, watching her soul dismantled by a stranger's cruelty. She was breathing in shallow, ragged gasps, on the verge of a total collapse. Precision matters when the world falls apart. You don't panic, you execute. I caught the eye of my head of security. A subtle nod that he understood meant clear the room. Then I turned my back on the investors, the critics, and the vultures with cameras. I faced Sloane. "Look at me," I said, my voice low, pitched under the rising noise of the crowd. She didn't move. Her eyes were fixed on the ruined canvas, tracking the drip of the red paint. "Sloane, look at me." She blinked, finally tearing her gaze away from the wreckage. Her eyes were wide, dark, and swimming with a panic that threatened to spill over. "It's ruined," she whispered, the words barely forming. "Everything." "It's paint," I corrected, stepping closer until I blocked her entire field of vision. "We fix paint. We don't fix you if you break down in front of the Times art critic." I didn't ask for permission. I reached out, gripping her upper arms. The contact was firm, grounding. I felt a tremor run through her frame, a vibration of pure adrenaline and devastation. I needed to anchor her before she drifted away completely. The cameras were getting closer, the flashes strobing against the walls like lightning in a bottle. They wanted the tearful shot. They wanted the artist on her knees. I wasn't going to give it to them. "We are leaving," I stated. It wasn't a suggestion. "My car is out back. I need to go home," she stammered, trying to pull away, her instinct to run taking over. "You can't go home," I said, tightening my grip slightly. "The press knows your address. They'll be waiting at your stoop before we even get the engine started. You want to face them alone tonight? You want them to see you like this?" She hesitated. The logic cut through the fog of her panic. She looked at the door, then back at me. She saw the calculation in my eyes, the absolute certainty that I had the situation handled. For a moment, the fierce artist flickered back to life, assessing the tactical reality. Then she slumped, just a fraction, leaning into my space. "No," she breathed. "Then you're with me." I released her arms and moved my hand to the small of her back, a guiding touch that felt electric through the silk. "Head down. Keep moving. Do not stop for anyone." I guided her toward the service corridor, the hidden artery of the gallery that the public never sees. As the heavy door clicked shut behind us, cutting off the noise and the blinding lights, the silence of the back hallway rushed in. But the tension didn't drop. It just changed shape, becoming something tighter, closer, and infinitely more dangerous. The corridors behind the showroom are where the illusion dissolves. Out front, it's all champagne and curated lighting. Back here, it's concrete, exposed ductwork, and the smell of unvarnished crate wood. I kept my hand on the small of her back, not just guiding her, but propelling her forward. She was moving on autopilot, her heels clicking an uneven, hollow rhythm against the sealed cement. It was the sound of someone who had lost their internal metronome. We passed the climate-controlled storage vaults, the heavy steel doors standing like silent sentinels. The silence here was different. It wasn't the stunned quiet of the gallery floor, but a dead industrial vacuum. It amplified the ragged sound of her breathing. She wasn't crying, not yet. She was hyperventilating, shallow little gasps that she was trying desperately to swallow. I didn't stop to offer platitudes. Comfort is inefficient when you're in the middle of an extraction. I pushed the crash bar on the rear exit, and the heavy door swung outward with a metallic groan. The city hit us instantly. The weather had turned hostile. The forecast had called for light showers, but this was a deluge, a curtain of gray water hammering the asphalt of the alleyway. The wind swept down the narrow canyon between the buildings, carrying the scent of wet ozone and exhaust. It was freezing, a sharp, biting cold that cut right through the adrenaline. Sloane stopped dead on the threshold, staring out at the rain as if it were just one more disaster she couldn't handle. "My car is 3 minutes out," I said, checking the time on my phone. The screen was wet in seconds. "We wait here." I stepped out first, pulling the collar of my trench coat up against the spray. Sloane hesitated, shivering in her silk, her bare arms exposed to the biting wind. I reached out, grabbing her wrist and pulling her into the shelter of the doorway's overhang. It wasn't enough. The wind was whipping the rain sideways, soaking the hem of her gown instantly. I moved closer. I unbuttoned my coat and pulled it wide, stepping into her space until we were toe-to-toe. "Come here," I said, my voice low but cutting through the sound of the storm. She looked at me, her eyes unfocused, hazel flecked with gold and terror. Then she stepped in. I wrapped the heavy wool of the coat around both of us, sealing us into a sudden, dark intimacy. The proximity was immediate. She was vibrating against me, a tremor that started in her bones. I felt the sharp angles of her shoulders, the tension coiled tight in her frame, and the erratic, frantic thumping of her heart against my ribs. The air between us thickened. I could smell the rain on her hair, mixing with the scent of her skin, something warm and spicy, like amber and stress. She had her hands pressed flat against my chest, likely to steady herself, but I could feel the erratic thumping of her heart against my own ribs. It was a chaotic rhythm, wild and unguarded. I looked down. She was staring at my throat, her lashes wet, a smudge of mascara darkening the corner of one eye. She looked wrecked. She looked beautiful. The protective instinct that flared in my chest wasn't just professional anymore. It was possessive. I tightened my arm around her waist, holding her steady against the storm. Then the twin beams of headlights cut through the gray sheets of rain. The heavy thud of the car door sealed us into a sudden, submerged silence. The interior of the sedan was a vacuum of expensive leather and climate-controlled stillness, a jarring counterpoint to the chaotic weeping of the city outside. I signaled the driver, just a single, sharp gesture, and the car surged forward, tires hissing against the slick asphalt. We were moving through the dark arteries of the city, the streetlights smearing across the rain-streaked windows in jagged bursts of neon blue and red. The light played across the back seat, illuminating us in fractured cinematic glimpses. Sloane had pushed herself into the far corner, pressing her shoulder against the door as if she could physically phase through the metal and escape. She was shivering violently now, the adrenaline crash hitting her with the force of a physical blow. The damp silk of her gown clung to her skin, dark and heavy, and she had her arms wrapped tight around her midsection, holding herself together by sheer force of will. I watched her profile in the strobing light. She looked shattered. The fierce, unyielding artist who had commanded the room an hour ago was gone, replaced by someone stripped down to the raw nerve. I could feel the vibration of her tremors through the leather seat, a constant, rhythmic shaking that filled the small space with a frantic energy. It was inefficient. It was dangerous. And, beneath my professional assessment, it woke something quiet and heavy in my chest. "Stop," I said. My voice was low, absorbed instantly by the plush interior. She didn't look at me. "I can't," she whispered. "I can't stop thinking about the sound of the paint hitting the canvas. It sounded like a butcher shop." "You are spiraling," I stated. I shifted, sliding across the leather until the distance between us was negligible. I reached out, placing my hand firmly on her knee. The contact was a shock. Through the damp, ruined fabric of her dress, the muscle beneath was coiled tight as a spring. I didn't pull away. I pressed down, adding the weight of my hand, anchoring her leg to the seat. "Breathe," I commanded. She froze. The shivering didn't stop, but her attention snapped to the point of contact. She looked down at my hand. My manicured fingers splayed possessively over her knee, and then up at my face. Her eyes were wide, searching mine in the gloom. The air in the car thickened instantly, charged with a sudden, sharp awareness of proximity. It wasn't sexual, not yet, but it was intimate in a way that felt dangerous. I was grounding her, yes, but I was also claiming the space. "I'm sorry," she choked out, her voice cracking. "I ruined your opening. The investors, the press. I'm so sorry." "Don't," I cut her off, my tone sharp enough to slice through the self-pity. I tightened my grip on her knee, just a fraction. "We don't apologize for being targeted, Sloan. You didn't spill a drink. You were vandalized. There is a difference." "It feels like a failure," she admitted, the fight draining out of her. "It feels like a violation," I corrected, leaning in closer. "And we handle violations with strategy, not apologies." She stared at me, the hazel in her eyes catching the passing streetlights. For a second, the professional boundary that had always existed between us, the desk, the contracts, the gallery floor, dissolved completely. In the dark, enclosed geography of the car, we were just two women, wet and tired, breathing the same recycled air. The scent of her, rain, ozone, and that underlying spice, was overwhelming in the small space. I kept my hand on her knee, my thumb brushing the fabric in a slow, subconscious rhythm. I knew I should move it. I knew the exact line I was blurring, but I didn't let go. The car slowed, turning off the main avenue and into the warehouse district. The scenery changed from glass storefronts to heavy brick and iron. We pulled up to the curb of my building, a converted industrial fortress that looked less like a home and more like a stronghold. "Where are we?" she asked, looking out at the imposing steel doors. "My place," I said, finally pulling my hand back. The absence of contact felt colder than the rain. It's secure, it's quiet, and most importantly, nobody knows you're here. I opened the door, and the damp night air rushed in, breaking the spell. But the tension remained, a heavy, invisible weight that followed us out onto the pavement. We weren't just escaping the press anymore. We were stepping into something else entirely. The elevator opened directly into the penthouse, the doors sliding apart to reveal the sanctuary I had built against the city. I keyed the security code, and the heavy steel door slid back with a hushed, expensive glide. We stepped inside, and I locked the world out. The sound of the deadbolt sliding home was final, a heavy, metallic thud that severed the connection to the storm, the press, and the ruin of the gallery. My loft is a study in controlled isolation. It's an industrial space, vast and open, with 20-foot ceilings and exposed brick that I've softened with amber lighting and deep velvet shadows. The air here is always the same, dry, still, and scented with the lingering ghost of sandalwood and old paper. It is a space designed for silence, for the specific kind of solitude I require to balance the noise of my public life. But tonight, the silence felt different. It felt heavy, waiting to be filled. Sloane stood just inside the threshold, afraid to move. She looked like a shipwreck survivor, washed up on a very expensive beach. The water dripped from the hem of her ruined gown, creating a dark, spreading constellation on the polished concrete floor. She was shivering violently now, the adrenaline fading to reveal the bone-deep cold of the rain. She hugged herself, her bare arms pale and goose-fleshed, her eyes darting around the shadows of the room as if looking for a trap, or perhaps just unable to reconcile the stillness here with the violence of the last hour. "I'm dripping," she whispered, her voice small and fractured in the cavernous space. She looked down at the puddle forming around her heels, horrified. "I'm ruining your floor." "The floor is sealed concrete," I said, my voice dropping into a register that was half command, half caress. "It can handle a little water. You, however, are turning blue." I moved to the linen closet, my footsteps silent on the vintage rugs. I pulled out a bath sheet, slate gray, heavy Egyptian cotton, the kind that feels like a weighted blanket. I walked back to her. She hadn't moved an inch. I opened the towel wide and stepped into her space, draping the heavy fabric over her shoulders. I pulled the ends together in front of her chest, cinching her in. For a moment, my hands lingered on the terry cloth, just inches from her collarbone. The proximity was sudden and sharp. I could smell the rain on her, ozone and wet silk, and the faint metallic scent of the gallery. She looked up at me, huddled into the towel, her eyes wide and unguarded. I was reading her shock, and the way her breath hitched when I tightened the towel. "Better?" I asked softly. "Warmer," she breathed. Her gaze dropped to my mouth, then darted away, a flush rising on her pale cheeks that had nothing to do with the temperature. "Thank you for getting me out." "Strategy," I murmured, stepping back to give her air, though the magnetic pull to stay close was an ache in my chest. But strategy requires a clear head, and you can't think when your teeth are chattering. You need to get out of those clothes. I looked at the ruined gown. It was a total loss, stained with mud and the memory of the evening. The thought of her stripping it off in my space sent a spike of possessive heat through me that I hadn't accounted for. "Go," I said, nodding toward the frosted glass door of the bathroom. "The shower is stone, the water pressure is aggressive, and the soap is bergamot. Don't come out until the shivering stops." She looked at me, clutching the towel like armor, then nodded. I watched her walk away, the heavy door clicking shut, sealing her in with the steam. The moment she was gone, the loft felt empty, yet vibrating with the undeniable electric charge of her proximity. I turned away from the closed bathroom door and moved toward the sleeping quarters. My wardrobe isn't a closet. It is an open concept archive of my public armor, a row of organized monochrome that defines my silhouette in the art world. I ran my fingers along the rack, bypassing the sharp, structured blazers and the silk camisoles I wear to intimidate board members. Tonight required a different texture. I needed something that offered coverage, but felt like an embrace. I paused at the dress shirts. My fingers lingered on a crisp white button-down. It was a piece I usually wore to close deals. High thread count, structured collar, expensive. It was a shirt that projected authority. Handing it to her felt significant, a deliberate blurring of the line between my professional exterior and this sudden, damp domesticity. I pulled it off the hanger, the cotton whispering against the other fabrics. I grabbed a robe, too, a deep navy silk that felt like cool water against the skin. I walked back to the bathroom door. The sound of the shower was a steady, rhythmic hiss behind the wood, a barrier of noise that separated her naked vulnerability from my waiting precision. I knocked, a single rap of the knuckle against the grain. "Sloan, open up just a crack." The water stopped. A moment later, the door opened an inch. Steam escaped, curling around the frame, carrying the scent of my own soap, spicy bergamot and rain, now inextricably linked to her. A bare arm reached out. Her skin was flushed pink from the heat, wet droplets clinging to her wrist. "Here," I said, placing the stack of fabric into her damp palm. Our fingers brushed. The contact was brief, wet, and startlingly intimate. It wasn't just handing over cotton and silk. It was handing over a layer of my identity. I was dressing her in my life. "Thank you," she whispered, and the door clicked shut again. I retreated a few steps, leaning against the nearest wall, waiting. I found myself imagining the mechanics of it, her shedding the ruined, soaked gown, drying her skin with my slate gray towels, buttoning my shirt over her chest. The thought was intrusive, possessive, and entirely involuntary. I took a deep breath, forcing the cool air of the loft to settle the heat rising in my chest. I deal in logic, in controlled variables, but there was no variable for this. The specific tension of a strange, beautiful woman wearing your clothes in your sanctuary while a storm rages outside. Then the door opened. She stepped out, and the air in the room seemed to stutter. The steam billowed around her like a soft focus lens, but the details were razor sharp. The shirt was massive on her. The shoulder seams hung halfway down her biceps, and the hem hit her mid-thigh, curved and crisp. She had rolled the sleeves up, but they were still loose, swallowing her hands. She hadn't tied the robe. It hung open, framing the white cotton, the dark silk contrasting with the stark brightness of the shirt. But it was the legs that undid me, bare, pale, and impossibly long, ending in bare feet on my dark hardwood floors. There is a specific kind of vulnerability in seeing someone without their shoes, without the layers they present to the world. She looked stripped down, reset. I kept my face neutral, the gallery owner mask firmly in place, but my pulse hammered a different rhythm. She looked soft. She looked owned. She walked toward me, tugging self-consciously at the hem of the shirt. "I feel like a child playing dress-up," she said, a nervous laugh bubbling up. "I'm drowning in this." "You're not drowning," I said. My voice dropped an octave, rougher than I intended. I pushed off the wall. "You're recovering." She stopped a few feet away, sensing the shift in gravity. She looked up at me, her hair slicked back wet, exposing the clean, elegant line of her jaw. "It's a very nice shirt. I feel guilty wearing it. It feels expensive." "It is," I admitted, stepping into her space. I couldn't help it. The pull was magnetic. "But it looks stiff on the hanger. It needed—" I reached out, then hesitated. My hands hovered for a second before I took the lapels of the robe and adjusted them, pulling the silk smoother over her shoulders. My knuckles grazed the cotton, covering her collarbone. It needed life. She went still, her breath hitching, a tiny, audible catch. She looked up at me, her hazel eyes wide, searching my face. The dynamic had pivoted. We weren't rescuer and victim anymore. We were two women, standing in a dim room, the scent of bergamot and rain between us, the silence heavy with things we weren't saying. "You look better in it than I ever did," I murmured, the compliment landing with the weight of a stone in deep water. A flush rose from her chest, blooming red across her neck. She didn't look away. "I don't think that's true," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "But I'm glad you think so." The tension was a wire pulled tight, humming. If I leaned in, if I closed that final inch... But no, not yet. She was still vulnerable, still stranded. "Come," I said, stepping back and breaking the circuit with sheer willpower. "You need food. And wine. I have a bottle that needs to be opened, and I suspect you need a drink as much as I do." Cooking for me is an exercise in controlled chaos. I don't follow recipes. I understand chemistry, and I understand heat. I moved around the kitchen island, a slab of honed volcanic stone that cost more than my first car, with the same economy of motion I use in a boardroom. I wasn't just making dinner. I was reestablishing the parameters of the evening. I needed to shift the energy from rescue mission to something more balanced, more reciprocal. I pulled a cast iron skillet from the rack, the metal heavy and cold in my hand. I set it over a high flame. I chopped garlic, the knife hitting the wooden board in a rapid, rhythmic staccato that echoed in the high ceilings of the loft. Tap, 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 tap. Precise, unforgiving. I could feel Sloane watching me from the other side of the island. She was leaning against the stone, wrapped in my robe, clutching the glass of water like a lifeline. She was lulled by the competence on display, her eyes tracking the movement of the knife, the flare of the gas burner, the way I tossed fresh herbs into the oil. The scent of rosemary and searing garlic hit the air instantly, aggressive and grounding, cutting through the damp, metallic smell of the storm. "You're very efficient," she observed, her voice soft, competing with the hiss of the pan. "Inefficiency offends me," I replied without looking up, flipping a steak with tongs. "Time is the only asset you can't leverage." I reached for the wine. I'd chosen a heavy, complex red, a Barolo that needed time to breathe, much like us. I poured 2 glasses, the liquid dark and velvety against the crystal. I slid one across the stone toward her. She reached for it. Our timing was off, or perhaps perfectly on. Her fingers brushed mine as she took the stem. It wasn't a graze, it was a collision. The contact lingered for a heartbeat too long, a silent acknowledgement of the electricity humming under the domestic surface. "To contingency plans," I toasted, lifting my glass. "To dry clothes," she countered, taking a sip. She closed her eyes as the wine hit her tongue. "Oh, that is serious wine." "I don't believe in unserious things," I said, plating the food. "Now, tell me about the piece, the one they targeted. Why that one?" She hesitated, setting the glass down. It sounds pretentious when I say it out loud. Try me. I have a high tolerance for pretension. It's the industry standard. "It's about the intersection of vulnerability and structural decay," she recited, the academic armor sliding back into place. "Specifically, how steel oxidizes when exposed to the elements, bleeding rust like a wound. I spent 6 months layering that canvas to look like metal weeping. I leaned against the counter, crossing my ankles, studying her. So you paint industrial decay. I paint the moment something strong finally breaks, she corrected, a little sharper. It sounds poetic, I challenged, swirling my wine. But is it sustainable? You're spending months analyzing breakage. Does that actually change the viewer, or is it just trauma dressed up in oil paint? I saw it then. The spark. Her spine straightened inside the oversized shirt. Her eyes narrowed, the hazel turning dark and fierce. She wasn't the stranded girl anymore. She was the expert, and I had just stepped on her turf. It's not trauma, she said, her voice dropping, steady and hard. It's inevitability. If we don't acknowledge the fracture points, the collapse takes us by surprise. I'm not painting the break to glorify it. I'm painting the warning signs. You work in galleries. You, of all people, should know that if you ignore the cracks in the foundation, the roof comes down. The fire in her voice delighted me. It was visceral. She pushed back against my cynicism, not with defensiveness, but with conviction. She had teeth. Touché, I murmured, hiding a smile behind the rim in my glass. I stand corrected. The tension in the room shifted again, deepening. The smell of the food, the warmth of the wine, the relentless drumming of the rain against the dark windows, it all conspired to create a bubble of intimacy. We ate standing up at the island, the silence between us no longer awkward, but charged with a new intellectual respect. Let's move, I said, picking up the bottle. The couch is more forgiving than the bar stools. The living area is dominated by deep, midnight blue velvet. A couch designed for long nights and loose conversations where boundaries naturally begin to blur. I moved to the far end, kicking off my heels and tucking my legs under me, sinking into the plush fabric. I watched Sloane hesitate. There is a specific intimacy to a couch like this. Once you sit, you are committed to the gravity of the cushions. She chose the opposite end, maintaining a polite, safe distance of about 3 feet. She curled her legs up, the hem of my white shirt riding up her thigh, the navy silk robe pooling around her like dark water. I put a record on, Coltrane, Blue and Green, and the melancholic, smoky saxophone drifted through the room, mingling with the steady rhythm of the rain against the glass. The atmosphere shifted from the sharp, bright energy of the kitchen to something darker, slower, and infinitely more charged. So, she started, turning her body to face me, resting her arm on the back of the couch. She looked comfortable now, the wine flushing her cheeks, the fear from the gallery completely dissolved. You dismantle problems. You run a gallery that breaks careers or makes them. You have a loft that looks like it belongs in Architectural Digest. What is the actual job? Because gallery owner feels like a euphemism for something else. I manage narratives, I said, swirling the last of the Barolo in my glass. When a story breaks that shouldn't, or when a collector needs to see a piece in a specific light, I architect the perspective. I don't change the art, Sloane. I just adjust the lighting. You manipulate the truth, she challenged, a playful glint in her eyes. You're a professional liar. I'm a professional editor, I corrected, leaning my head back against the velvet. There is no such thing as objective truth in our industry. You paint the decay. I decide if that decay is tragic or revolutionary. That's an editorial choice. You and I do the same thing. I just get paid better for it. She laughed, a low, throaty sound that surprised me. It wasn't the polite laugh of a guest. It was the genuine amusement of an equal. That is the most cynical justification for spin I have ever heard. But, she paused, tilting her head, studying me with an intensity that made the air in the room feel suddenly thin. I suspect you're actually very good at it. You have a way of making control feel like safety. The comment landed with precision. I felt a flicker of heat in my chest that had nothing to do with the wine. She was seeing past the suit, past the loft, right into the machinery of how I operated. Control is safety, I murmured. Chaos is just a failure of imagination. Is that why you helped me? She asked. The playfulness vanished, replaced by a soft, probing curiosity. She leaned in, closing the distance between us by mere inches, but the shift felt seismic. Because I was chaos? Because I was a disorderly element in your perfectly curated evening? You were a variable in distress, I said, dodging the emotional core of the question. And I hate wasted potential. I don't believe you, she said softly. No. She shook her head, a strand of damp hair falling over her eyes. She brushed it back, a gesture so unselfconscious and graceful it made my breath catch. I think you saw someone drowning. And I think, under all this, she gestured to the room, to the walls of books, to my perfectly tailored existence. I think you like being the one who holds the lifeline. I stared at her. She was dissecting me with the same rigorous intensity she applied to her canvases, peeling back the layers of my carefully constructed persona. And the terrifying part was that I liked it. I liked being seen by her. You're dangerous, I said, my voice dropping to a whisper. I'm just an artist in a borrowed shirt, she countered. But her smile was knowing. The debate fell away. The intellectual sparring match had served its purpose. It had burned off the awkwardness, established our footing, and brought us here, to this silence. The jazz played on, a slow, winding trumpet solo. But the room felt silent. The distance between us on the couch, those 3 safe feet, suddenly felt like a canyon we were both leaning over. I looked at her, the softness of her mouth, the intelligence in her eyes, the way the oversized collar of my shirt framed her neck. I wanted to reach out. I wanted to bridge the gap, to trace the line of her jaw with my thumb, to see if her skin felt as soft as it looked. The pull was physical, a magnetic drag in the center of my chest. I saw her gaze drop to my lips, then snap back up to my eyes, her pupils blown wide. She felt it too. The air was thick with it, heavy and electric. For a long moment, nobody moved. We just existed in the tension, letting it coil tighter and tighter. It was a precipice. One move, one touch, and the night would fracture into something else entirely. Then the record ended. The needle hissed in the groove, the sudden absence of music crashing into the room like a wave. I blinked, breaking the trance. I glanced at the vintage clock on the wall. It was nearly 2 a.m. The adrenaline of the rescue and the wine had masked the exhaustion, but now it hit me, and with it, the logistical reality of the night. It's late, I said, my voice sounding rough to my own ears in the sudden silence. And we have a logistical problem to solve regarding the furniture. I can take the couch, Sloane offered quickly, the politeness of a well-raised guest warring with the exhaustion visible in the slump of her shoulders. She looked at the velvet landscape we were sitting on. Really, I've slept in library carrels and on studio floors. This is luxury compared to that. Absolutely not, I countered, my voice leaving no room for argument. I stood up, smoothing the lines of my trousers, reasserting the control that had slipped during the conversation. The problem with open concept living is that it prioritizes aesthetic flow over traditional privacy. But I don't host guests by putting them on furniture that will ruin their spinal alignment. You've had a crisis, Sloane. You need actual rest, not a nap. And while this couch is Italian velvet and cost a fortune, it is designed for cocktails and posture, not REM cycles. So you take the couch? She raised an eyebrow, a faint challenge returning to her expression. I am 34 years old, and I own the deed to this building, I said dryly, moving to clear the throw pillows. I don't sleep on couches in my own home. The silence stretched, the implication landing between us with a soft thud. There was only one option left. Sloane looked at the bed. It was a statement piece, a low, sprawling platform covered in charcoal linen, sitting on a raised dais like a modern altar. It dominated the far corner of the loft, a vast expanse of dark fabric that suddenly looked incredibly intimate. It's a California king, I added, framing it as a spatial statistic rather than an invitation. It's roughly the size of a small European country. We can stay on opposite coastlines. You won't even know I'm there. She bit her lip, looking at the expanse of dark linen, then back at me. The logic held, even if the propriety was thin. Okay, she conceded. Logistics. Opposite coastlines, strictly territorial. Strictly territorial, I agreed. I moved to the wall panel. I'm killing the lights. I slid the dimmer down. The warm amber glow of the studio collapsed, swallowed by the sudden rush of shadows. But it wasn't pitch black. The floor-to-ceiling windows, lashed by the relentless rain, let in the ambient bleed of the city. A diffuse, steely blue light filtered through the glass, turning the room into a monochrome photograph. The rain shadows ran down the walls like living ink, moving in time with the storm outside. Sloane stood by the side of the bed, a pale ghost in my white shirt. The darkness made the intimacy sharper, stripping away the social cues of the lit room. In the light, we were two professionals managing a situation. In the dark, we were just bodies in a room. "Do you need anything else?" I asked, my voice naturally dropping lower in the dark. "No," she whispered. "I'm good." I walked to my side of the bed, the east coast of our arrangement. I stripped off my blazer, draping it over a chair with deliberate care. I hesitated, then unbuttoned my cuffs, rolling them up to my elbows. I kept my camisole and trousers on, a necessary layer of armor. I wasn't stripping down, not tonight. The risk was too high. We climbed in simultaneously, a synchronized domestic movement that felt bizarrely natural for two strangers. The mattress was firm, high-density memory foam that absorbed the weight without bouncing, but I still felt the shift. The bed, despite my claims of it being a country, felt suddenly finite. Sloane stayed rigidly on her edge, pulling the duvet up to her chin, creating a wall of fabric. I lay on my back, staring at the exposed ductwork on the ceiling, illuminated by a passing headlight that swept across the room like a searchlight. "Good night, Sloane," I said into the dark. "Good night." The silence returned, heavy and pressurized. I could hear her breathing, shallow, uneven. My senses, usually disciplined and directed toward business, were rioting. I was hyper-aware of the friction of the sheets, the scent of her shampoo, my shampoo, wafting from the pillow next to mine, and the knowledge that just 2 feet away, she was lying there, in my shirt, bare-legged. I closed my eyes, but the image of her in the bathroom door burned behind my lids. The vulnerability, the trust, the way she had looked at me on the couch. I wanted to reach out. The impulse was a physical ache in my palm. I wanted to slide my hand across the cool linen until I found her warmth. I wanted to know if she was asleep, or if she was lying there staring at the ceiling too, wondering about the stranger who had pulled her out of the rain. I felt a protective, possessive weight settling in, warring with the logic I prided myself on. But I didn't move. I lay perfectly still, a statue of restraint, listening to the rain and the soft, rhythmic sound of the woman beside me breathing, letting the slow burn of the night settle deep into my bones. The territorial lines felt fragile, drawn in sand while the tide was coming in. 3 a.m. is a specific kind of country. It has its own laws, its own gravity, and its own brutal honesty. The rain had settled into a monotonous, weeping rhythm against the glass. No longer a storm, but a persistent, soaking reality. I hadn't slept. I was lying perfectly still, eyes adjusted to the gloom, watching the way the city lights filtered through the water on the window, casting rippling blue-gray shadows across the ceiling. It looked like we were underwater. Beside me, the coastline I had established was eroding. Sloane was restless. I could feel the minute shifts in the mattress, the tension in the linen every time she adjusted her legs. She wasn't tossing and turning. She was vibrating with a frequency of anxiety that cut through the quiet. "You're thinking so loud I can't hear the rain," I whispered into the dark. The rustling stopped. "I'm sorry," she whispered back. "I can't turn my brain off. I keep seeing the red paint. I keep seeing the way I froze." "Stop," I said. "The paint is a solvable variable. It's logistics, Sloane, not a Greek tragedy." "It's not the paint." The admission hung in the air, fragile. This was the midnight truth, where you can say things to a ceiling that you can't say to a face. I turned my head on the pillow. "Then what is it?" "It's the exposure," she confessed, the words tumbling out now. "I've spent 2 years building this armor. The leather jackets, the silence, the reputation for being untouchable. But tonight, they saw me terrified. They saw me small." She paused, the shame distinct in her tone. "I feel like a fraud, like they finally realized the emperor has no clothes, just a ruined dress." "Imposter syndrome," I diagnosed softly. "It's boring, Sloane. Everyone has it. The biggest collector in the city hyperventilated in my office last week before buying a Basquiat. Fear isn't an indicator of incompetence. It's an indicator of stakes." "It feels like a warning," she murmured. "Like the universe is telling me to stop." "The universe is indifferent," I countered, shifting my body. The movement was instinctive. I turned onto my side, facing her. It's raining because of atmospheric pressure, not because of your career. You were vandalized because your work provokes a reaction, not because you failed. You were looking for a sign to quit because it's easier than risking the next step. But I've seen you fight. I saw you in the kitchen. You have teeth, Sloane. You just forgot how to bite. The sheets rustled. She turned too. Suddenly, the vast expanse of the California King vanished. We were facing each other in the blue-lit dark, the distance between our faces less than a foot. I could see the glint of her eyes, searching mine. The proximity was overwhelming. The scent of her warm skin, my soap, and the faint metallic tang of the night filled my lungs. You make it sound so simple, she whispered. You strip everything down to mechanics. Mechanics work, I said. Structure is reliable. Is that what this is? She moved her hand, and I felt her fingers graze the pillowcase just inches from my cheek. Structure? I faltered. This is shelter. She shifted closer. The space between us was charged, electric. I could feel her breath, warm and uneven, ghosting across my lips. The vulnerability she had laid bare demanded a response that wasn't clinical. She needed to be anchored. I reached out. My hand moved through the dark, crossing the treaty line we'd drawn. My fingers brushed the hair back from her temple, tucking a loose strand behind her ear. The contact was a spark. Her skin was incredibly soft, fever warm against my cool fingertips. She didn't pull away. She leaned into the touch, her eyes fluttering shut. You aren't a fraud, I murmured, my thumb tracing the line of her cheekbone. You're just tired, and you're terrified. But tomorrow, we rewrite the narrative. We turn the vandalism into part of the exhibit. We make it look like the red paint was the point all along. Because I don't invest in bad assets. She let out a shaky breath, her hand coming up to catch my wrist. She held it there, pressing my palm against her face. It was an intimacy that bypassed the physical and went straight to the bone. Thank you, she breathed. We stayed like that, hovering on the precipice. I could have kissed her. The angle was right, the pull was undeniable. I wanted to. I wanted to close that final inch and taste the relief on her mouth. But the timing was wrong. She was vulnerable, and I was the one with the power. To cross that line now would be to break the trust I'd just built. So I held the tension. I let it burn. A slow, exquisite ache in my chest. Sleep, I ordered softly, though my voice lacked its usual command. Okay, she whispered. She didn't let go of my hand. She adjusted her pillow, settling down, but kept her fingers laced loosely around my wrist, anchoring herself to me. I watched her breathing slow, watched the tension drain from her frame as sleep finally pulled her under. I lay awake for a long time, listening to the rain, feeling the electric weight of her touch, knowing that, come morning, the logic of the daylight would change everything. Sunlight hit the loft like a revelation. It wasn't the gray, filtered light of the storm anymore. It was sharp, unapologetic morning gold that sliced through the floor-to-ceiling windows, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. I woke up to the silence of it. The rain had finally stopped, leaving the city outside scrubbed clean and glistening. I reached out instinctively. The space beside me on the vast mattress was empty, the charcoal linen cool to the touch, but the pillow still held the faint indentation of her head and the lingering scent of bergamot. I wasn't panicked. There was a steady, rhythmic sound coming from the kitchen, the mechanical whir of the grinder, the heavy tamp of the portafilter against the counter, the hiss of steam. It was the sound of my morning routine, precise and calibrated. But I wasn't the one doing it. I got up, pulling on my silk robe and tying the sash tight, grounding myself in the ritual. Walking out into the main space felt different today. The shadows were gone. The loft was bright, exposing every corner. But it didn't feel vulnerable. It felt properly lived in. Sloane was at the espresso machine. She was still wearing my white shirt. The fabric was rumpled now, creased from sleep and warmth, the top button undone. She had found a pair of thick wool socks from my drawer, gray cashmere, and was sliding slightly across the polished floor as she moved between the grinder and the sink. She looked ridiculous and entirely perfect. She looked like she had been standing in my kitchen for years, inhabiting my space with a casual grace that dismantled my defenses. "You know how to operate a La Marzocco," I said, leaning against the doorframe, my voice husky with sleep. She didn't jump this time. She turned, a mug in her hand, steam curling up around her face in the sunbeams. Her hair was a mess, a dark, tangled halo of bedhead that made my fingers itch to smooth it down. "I told you, I'm an artist. Caffeine is the only variable I can control with absolute precision." She slid the mug across the volcanic stone island toward me. It was perfect. The crema was thick, hazelnut-colored, unbroken. I walked over and took a sip. It was rich, hot, and frankly better than I made it. "Acceptable?" she asked, a tease in her voice, leaning her hip against the counter. "Dangerous," I corrected, holding her gaze over the rim. "You're making yourself indispensable. And that is a risky strategy with someone who doesn't like to let go of good assets." We stood there in the quiet of the morning, the city humming below us, the light warming the hardwood. The frantic energy of last night, the tears, the panic, the midnight confessions in the dark, had evaporated with the rain. What was left was this, a quiet, steady hum of domesticity that felt terrifyingly natural. "The cleaners are done at the gallery," I said, checking the time on the microwave display. "We can go assess the damage. Or," I paused, looking at the way the sunlight caught the curve of her neck, "we can drink the coffee while it's hot." Sloane looked down into her mug, swirling the dark liquid. The relief I expected to see regarding the gallery wasn't there. Instead, there was a hesitation, a reluctance that mirrored the heavy, anchoring weight in my own chest. "I suppose I should pack," she said, but she didn't move toward her ruined dress. "Get back to the real world. Face the critics." "The critics can wait," I said, setting my mug down. I walked around the island. I moved into her space, not with the urgency of the rescue or the tension of the night, but with a calm, deliberate claim. I stopped in front of her. She looked up, her eyes clear in the morning light. "You don't have to rush. The gallery is closed today. The light here is good for planning the counterattack." A smile tugged at the corner of her mouth, soft and genuine. "Are you offering me a workspace, or are you just looking for another debate?" "I'm offering you breakfast," I said, reaching out to tuck a strand of hair behind her ear. A callback to the darkness, but now in the brave, bright light of day. My thumb lingered on her jawline. "And I'm suggesting that perhaps the universe didn't ruin your painting to punish you. Maybe it just wanted you to stop running long enough to be found." She leaned into my touch, her cheek warm against my palm. "I think I'd like that," she whispered, opening her eyes to look at me with unflinching clarity. Staying. It wasn't a promise of forever. We were barely 24 hours in. But it was a start. The crisis was over, but the story was just beginning. The heavy steel door clicked shut behind us an hour later. But this time, we were on the same side of it. We walked out into the crisp, rain-washed city, shoulder to shoulder, heading toward the gallery not as rescuer and victim, but as partners. The chaos had finally cleared, leaving only the undeniable clarity of the connection forged between us. If you have ever found sudden clarity in the middle of a dark storm, subscribe for more stories.